let's get started. My name's Alan Regenberg, and I'm an associate faculty member and director of outreach and research support at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, and I'm a member of the Johns Hopkins eSchool Plus initiative team. On behalf of members of the eSchool Plus initiative, I want to officially welcome you to the fourth session in our second eSchool Plus webinar series. And today's session is Addressing Learning Loss in Special Education. Our goal for this session is to explore how and why reopening schools has become a highly charged issue for our special needs learners, and to consider what this may mean for equity, learning, and schools both now as schools continue to reopen, as well as post-pandemic. We'll also explore some of the enormous hurdles that K-12 schools across the nation continue to face in the midst of this unprecedented COVID pandemic. As we have seen, the challenges of reopening have been divisive, particularly for families of color and schools serving large populations of vulnerable students, particularly students with special needs. What is the long-term impact of the pandemic on providing services for students with special needs? To help us answer that question today, we've invited some of the foremost education practitioners from across the country as experts to discuss the topic in a complex, changing, and highly consequential landscape. So first, let me introduce our panelists. First up, I'd like to welcome Aaron Parsons. Dr. Parsons is the Vice President of School Programs for Kennedy Krieger Institute. He oversees several of the Institute's school programs, as well as admissions, regulatory compliance, and transition services, in addition to psychological and behavioral services. He's also certified as a superintendent of schools and has served as public policy chair for the National Association of Private Special Education Centers. He currently sits on the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee at Kennedy Krieger and has expressed significant interest in ensuring that KKI is actively addressing these structural inequities in both education and health access. Thank you for being here today, Aaron. Next, we're honored to have with us Laurie DeBettencourt, who currently serves as professor and program lead for the special education programs in the Johns Hopkins School of Education, where she oversees all master's programs and certificates within the special education programs. In addition, she serves as coordinator for a pre-service training partnership with the Montgomery County Public Schools. She's the past editor of the Teacher Education and Special Education Journal. Dr. DeBettencourt has co-authored several textbooks and written numerous articles related to instruction of students with mild to moderate disabilities. She was awarded a Fulbright scholarship in Budapest, Hungary during the spring semester of 2018. Pleased to have you with us today, Laurie. And finally, we have with us, last but not least, Cheryl Holcomb-McCoy, who currently serves as professor and dean of the School of Education at American University. Dr. Holcomb-McCoy joined American University in 2016, and prior to this, she served as Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs, Vice Dean of Academic Affairs, and Chair in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. She has held appointments as Associate Professor of Counselor Education at the University of Maryland College Park and Assistant Professor and Director of the School Counseling Program at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. Professional colleagues have recognized her with many awards for outstanding multicultural diversity research, excellence in teaching, and exemplar service. Particularly her most recent work around anti-racism in educator preparation. She is also the mother of a special needs child. We are honored to have you with us today, Cheryl. So thank you all for being here. And now to our audience, a few guidelines about our discussion this afternoon. I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists one question just to get the discussion started. Then I'll be directing a series of prepared questions to the entire group to consider. And we want you, our audience, to join in also. You can submit your questions by pressing the Q&A button and below, and the bottom of your screen. And you can also upvote other people's questions by clicking the like button in the Q&A window. We'll incorporate as many of the questions as possible, and we'll start to feed these in about halfway through our discussion during the hour. Again, welcome everyone, and let's get started with this really interesting and difficult topic. Aaron, let's begin with you. Among other things, you're responsible for overseeing several of Kennedy Krieger Institute's school programs, and you've shepherded them through the challenges of the past year. Given this experience, and in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges in reopening or reshaping schools for special needs students? And how have special education programs like the one you currently run adapted their operations to respond to the needs of learners?
Well, thanks, Alan. We talked late last week, and I'd commented on really thinking about this question and actually laughing at myself a bit, just because, after much thinking, I was unable to identify a single greatest challenge. And I think that is the greatest challenge in itself, is that there are multiple significant challenges all at play at once. And, in a population with special needs like the students we serve at Kennedy Krieger Institute, we know there's no substitute for in-person instruction or delivery of related services. There just isn't. We've had a very small number of students who did well in virtual services, but the majority really need clinicians, expert special educators with them in the classroom, to provide the supports and instruction they need. So that's been difficult. We're also in a position to know, because we're part of a research and treatment hospital, that people with special needs or particular disabling conditions are especially at risk for a serious, significant outcome from a COVID-19 exposure. So we're really talking about, in some cases, up to 3 times the likelihood of a fatality from COVID. So these are the individuals who still need that in-person service. So I think that is really where all these problems, come together, where, the most difficult thing is we're unable to do what it is we know we should be doing, which is delivering special education related services in person. Kennedy Krieger and other schools like ours are taking some of the same steps that some of the other comprehensive settings are taking, the use of hybrid schedules to try to increase social distancing. But again, with our students, that's very difficult to do. They often need assistance where the adult is really with them, assisting them. So significant use of PPE and really strict adherence to mitigation guidelines. Some of the more, I think, particular undertakings that we've had are, for instance, masking clinics under the supervision of our behavior analysts to increase masking skills with some students that, masking is very difficult for them to engage in or tolerate, or in some cases, they may be unable to do this at all. So I would say that's some of the ways that we've responded that's slightly different from comprehensive settings. But I believe at the end of the day, we're all facing very similar issues. And that is the fact that for most of our students, there really is no substitute for in-person services. So what we need to do, and I know it's a rush between, pandemic and the vaccination efforts, but really it's that return to in-person services and the recognition that even as we return, this is not going to be a quick fix. There is no immediate solution to this. It's going to require a lot of analysis, a lot of individual, approaches with each student, a real recognition of what their loss has been during this time, and then very thoughtful and specific work with that individual student to try to, bring them back to where we believe they should have been at this time. So again, not a single greatest challenge, but multiple challenges.
Sounds daunting. Laurie, let's turn to you. You have extensive experience and expertise in preparing teachers for their roles in working in special needs classrooms and with special needs students. What are you hearing from your graduate students and others about how special needs students and their teachers have been particularly impacted by this pandemic? And what are some of the challenges you see happening on the ground as schools move towards fully reopening for in-person instruction?
Well, recently I asked my special educators who are out in the field to write an impact statement of what this past year has been like for them. And as you can imagine, I received a broad array of responses. The overwhelming responses included discussion about the stress of that initial transition to virtual instruction. It was a real sharp learning curve for many of these educators, including not only learning how to use the technology themselves, but how to get the devices to students, how to deal with internet outages, and how to use the new technology, Zoom, and other things like Nearpod. And these issues added to their teaching responsibilities. Many felt that there was an extra layer of stress was added to their lives and to the students and their parents as well. Many parents had to assist their child during the instructional periods. And many students didn't know how to access the Zoom alone and by themselves. So as the schools now have moved to some in-person teaching, it's become clear that some students have regressed in their skill levels. Many special educators have remarked that learning how to use the new technology and to communicate with parents has been a positive aspect of the pandemic. And as we move forward, we will continue to instruct special educators in using the virtual environment, maybe to hold IEPs with parents or to use newfound skills in the technology world to teach their students in their in-person classrooms. So the pandemic has strengthened special educators' strengths and shown, though, also the disparities between student access, students who've had to share devices with siblings or have lived in areas with reduced access to the internet, or have had parents who could not provide support. Some of those students have done much worse than their well-off peers. Some IEP goals and objectives haven't been able to be measured. So those teachers are worried, like, how do I fill out the IEP in terms of what growth has the child made or not made? I will say that I'm very proud of how so many special educators have met the challenges of this past year, yet I worry about their stress and their emotional well-being, as we know that nationally we're suffering from a shortage of certified special educators.
Lots of big problems. Thank you. Cheryl, let's get you into the conversation. You have unique expertise here. You have a long experience as an educator. You're the dean of a school of education that is also focused on teacher training. And you have long been a champion of the important work that classroom teachers do. And you also see the work of reopening schools for students with special needs from the lens of a parent. How do you think the year has gone for special needs students overall? And if you don't mind sharing with us, how has it been going for your family?
So first of all, thanks for having me today. And it's really an important conversation. And I'm happy to have a conversation as a parent that we have Laurie here and Aaron that can be wear the educator's hat. You know, it's been my daughter, Nia, who has, developmental disabilities that impact her speech and language, and some of her fine motor skills as well. I always do the cutting, because when she was small, we used to talk about, her ability to cut, which was something that was one of the objectives in her kindergarten and first grade years. It has been an up and down year. And I think it's really important for us to say that, children with disabilities, and Laurie and Aaron know this, that the disabilities can be bundled together in unique ways for every child. So you cannot talk generally about all students with disabilities because they vary depending on background, the disability, and there's just so many other factors. But for Nia, this has been, hasn't been a horrible year. I think the adjustment for all of us was fast, quick, and it was disruptive. But I must say, because she does most of her communication sometimes using the keypad instead of her language, this was sort of a relief that everyone is typing in a chat she's not the only one. So, because usually that's how she prefers to communicate with others. So for her, that was, she was not, different from the other kids. And so this was really nice for her. I have to say that the teachers have worked really, really hard to make the adjustment and worked with the parents a great deal. I've been really, really pleased with the communication. Nia is in Montgomery County Public Schools. It has been, the amount of communication has been great. The only thing that has been probably the biggest downer are the emotional, social peer relationships, the absence of being able to be with one's peers and typically developing peers. Nia is in and out of classrooms with some self-contained classrooms and some that are not. And so she has been missing some of that interaction just in the hallways and just, at the cafeteria, in PE, just some of those, spontaneous conversations. So it has been, like I said, it's been a mixed bag. I think that's the difficulty of really being able to discuss this in one conversation, special education across the spectrum, is that it varies for different children and for different families. And having a mother that's in education obviously is a privilege that my daughter has someone that can seek out resources. I worry about those parents who do not know where to turn if they're in trouble or they need help. That is a huge concern. So the issues around equity that we have in general still exist and are exacerbated now in this kind of a setting. I do want to say too that as a parent, there's no more nervous, uptight, anxious parent than a parent of a special education child. So when we first got word that this was happening, immediately there's a rush of anxiety. And so I think, the need for teachers and educators to understand that special education parents will have a multitude of questions that are unique to their child, that there are issues of feeling helpless, which comes with the territory. And so educators must be patient and understanding, I think, of parents who have special needs children and what this type of, just not only now we're pivoting back into the school. So there's just as much anxiety around health issues because many special needs kids have special health concerns. So going back into the school building is just as disruptive going back. We know that there's possible learning loss, but then there's like, oh, but what about health and all of these other factors that, a lot of moms, dads, and family members are really worried about. So that's, from a parent's perspective, I think it's hard to talk about our issues in one big lump. But one thing you can say is that we are probably the most anxious group of parents around. That's for sure.
Thank you. Wow. So between the three of you, I'm hearing that we have a lot of different stakeholders. We've got the institutions and the teachers and the parents and the students themselves and probably family members and who knows who else involved. And that this is a big, very complicated setting where we're having, under this heading, a whole bunch of different needs for the students. And, so yeah, this seems very complicated. Hopefully we can unpack this in a way that becomes helpful instead of just, although I think if we just bring out all of the challenges here, that's also a contribution that's useful. But yeah, so, and then one piece that I'm hearing here is that generally the conversation around learning loss has fallen along the lines of race and just different kinds of existing systemic inequities over the past year. And that sparked a divide among parents and educators in the context of thinking about whether virtual learning itself has been harmful for students. Let me just ask, do you all think that this sort of partisanship, this kind of rhetoric and division represents a new normal for K-12 education?
I can say, I think it's just beginning the conversation out loud or having this conversation out loud. the inequities have existed for a long time. You can walk from one school district to another and see the differences in the supplies and the technology and the capabilities that one school might be able to offer another, their children in that school. So I'm glad the conversation is now being had out loud, and I'm hopeful that after the pandemic that we address some of the inequities. But we've all been home now for over a year, and we've been working at home. And those people who have been working at home, like Cheryl and others who have young kids at home, and do they have 1 or 2 computers? Do they have internet access? That's become much more obvious among those who have not or don't have those capabilities. Even if they have internet access, they may not have enough computers to go for the kids that they have in their house. So I, for one, am glad we're having the conversation out loud now. Let's now do something about it.
Thank you.
I have to agree. I've heard COVID described as a force multiplier, that it's just, you know, multiplied the force of inequity or disparity in access. And if you're, you know, from a family that's parented by essential workers with limited access to technology in a district that may be underfunded or, you know, underserved in its own way, there's just no way that this didn't have a stronger, deeper, greater impact on your household and your children. So I also agree. It's you know, it's not unlike the rest of the national conversation, I think, that we're having politically. And I know that it can cause a lot of anxiety. And I think that's an underlying issue through this whole last year or more. But I'm glad the discussion is on the table as well, because, you know, it's one of those sort of time to get real and what we're talking about and what this is actually meant for large portions of students in the U.S.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything that Laurie and Erin said. I also believe that this is a time for us to be very, very careful about language. And I had said earlier that, you know, just the notion of language loss, using that as a term, tends to feel deficit oriented, or it sounds like there's a deficiency somehow. And what I want us to stay away from is this ability or this tendency to want to categorize students by labels. And I am so afraid that, you know, students will come out of this period with those students who have lost the most, for instance, during this time. And that just further divides the inequities by just using that language. And, you know, why can't we talk about the students who've been resilient through this, you know, the persistence and the resiliency through this period, I think is just as important to measure as it is the learning loss, because we're categorizing this learning loss by metrics that we use when students were in school. These metrics were not determined by this type of a setting. So I think thinking through how we're describing this period is going to be really important, so that we're not, you know, furthering the disparities across groups. The other thing about the political nature of this, you know, I'm also just very sensitive to teachers' rights through this, as well as we talk about, you know, reopening or re-entering schools. It's important for us. I think that the political debate has been unfair, that we're talking about, whether or not teachers want to have a vaccination or not. I mean, they have children and they have families too. And so for us to, you know, imply that teachers somehow don't care about the learning of their students, that they're not wanting to go back to school. I haven't talked to a teacher yet that said, I don't want my students to do well, or I don't want to go back into a classroom. They just want to go back into classrooms and be okay, so that they can be there for their students. And so I think the political debate has been one that has been manufactured, and has been manufactured to create this against teachers' unions, against teachers, and, you know, and I find that incredibly unfair and not genuine at all, because I haven't met a teacher yet that didn't care about her students and the families in which she is working with or for.
And I do think that the teachers, they want to go back, they want to be safe, they want to live through it. But the other thing is that we have this discussion of Well, the teachers, are now teaching in person. Well, many of the teachers who are teaching in person are teaching in person and continuing to teach virtually. So it's almost double the work, because when you're teaching in person and you're teaching virtually, you cannot send a child or go with the child into an individual chat room to have a one-to-one conversation with that child, because you have this whole group or small group in front of you face to face. So they're having to do the virtual, they're having to do the in-person, they're having to plan for the in-person by cleaning their classroom. So they have to take off time, which they don't want to necessarily do, away from their students to go in and clean their classrooms. And we're putting so many demands on our teachers. And I really think that when we come out of this and somehow get past the medical part of it, that we now don't have to worry about COVID, I think what we need to do is start worrying about how do we help teachers and provide for them as they come out of this in terms of their stress level, but also how do we respect their job more? All of us know now who have children how much more difficult it is for these teachers. So we should respect them more by paying them more and by respecting their jobs more than just what we did prior to the pandemic. Many of them can't live on their salaries, right, if they're not married.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's teachers doing two jobs where both of them have tons of new aspects to it. The in-person's under all these new protocols that are unfamiliar, I'm sure, to all teachers.
And they're contacting parents at night. They're contacting kids through text messages. Some of them are driving to the kids' home to provide in-person type of activities, papers, or just to sit on the doorstep or the front porch and provide some instructions. So their day doesn't end like it did before, where the kids got on the bus and they may have gone home to prepare for the next day. Their actual day of duties doesn't end till late into the evening, and then they begin to prepare for the next day.
Yeah, it's the training for teachers, not for post-COVID classrooms, I think is going to be critical, because as we talk about students who are coming back to in-person learning from a year of really trauma. I have a counselor education background, and we can pretty much say that most of us have experienced trauma either through loss of family members and friends with COVID, the loss of going to school every day and seeing your friends is traumatic for many students. And through trauma, we know that there's a need for, extra support, as well as someone to hear them, the positive energy that's needed to overcome the trauma. And teachers need to be trained to be able to do that. I'm a huge proponent of all teachers having learning what special educators learn. We all should go through Laurie's program. We all need those skills. That's just good teaching. But I think also there's a need for the social emotional side of this too in classrooms, and teachers have to be trained in order to do that. And
then mental health. I mean,
that's the mental health piece.
And maybe that's one of the pieces that again has become front and center to all of us, because we're all anxious and had to deal with our own mental health through this. But I believe that teachers and counselors and school administrators and people like you, Erin, who are working with teachers at your school, we need to start thinking about how do we help them understand how to coach or see significant behaviors that are happening by the kids that might trigger some mental health issues, so that we can address them and provide support for them, because there's going to be a long lag time after we figure out how to do the vaccines and get people safe from COVID. There's still going to be many mental health issues.
We are really fortunate to have a staff of licensed clinical social workers who are case managing students at Kennedy, and they are seeing a lot of difficulty in the homes. Parents are really, they're our partners. Some of our parents they feel abandoned and angry, and they need someone to be angry with. And I've just accepted that. Some feel very, very close to us and are trying to help their students, range from, when they first re-entered the building, just the smiles, they're so happy to be back. And yet a lot of parents are fearful just because of, we still are in the middle of a pandemic and, children aren't vaccinated. And so my other concern, just the layer cake here, is that the special education teachers, I think many are well prepared for recognizing that mental stress in children and in the families, but they've also been asking for support themselves from us. And, everyone's hands are so full. I feel like most schools have not adequately supported their teachers, the teachers' mental health. And then my concern is when we're talking about the recovery, which, I'm thinking about a recovery summer and the additional services our students are going to make. I do see a question there about compensatory services, which I'm happy to hop into as well. But I've mentioned before that I'm in the buildings occasionally now, and we have some teachers who teach remotely from their classroom, and then others who I may see on Zooms or all staff meetings, and they look very tired because they've been working really hard. And I mentioned earlier that my neighbor is a teacher, and she mentioned that someone asked her how it felt to be back at work after she'd returned to her classroom after a year of, teaching at night. And it was very frustrating, but, this big lift that we're about to have to undertake, and we must do it. The big lift is again going to be made by our teachers and clinicians. And those are the folks who also need assistance themselves right now. So not to be, overly dramatic or, attempt to get sympathy, but just to acknowledge this issue that the folks who are going to be moving us forward are tired. And I think we need to prepare somehow to help them. It's pay, but it's more than pay. I think there's going to have to be a lot of discussions, make sure that we're all really understand that we're in this for the students, and that none of us would have chosen to be in this position. And
I will say, every time I have a seminar with my teachers who are in the field, I always ask, my first thing for this whole year has been, how are you doing? And one night after that, one student wrote to me separately and she said, I really appreciate you asking me that, because there are some weeks where I'm not doing very well at all. And I just appreciate someone asking how I'm doing. And I think that's probably true for a good number of the teachers who are out there in the field right now. And you're right, the parents too.
Yeah, I would say most, that our parents and our teachers are very tired. They've done a great job. The parents have been amazing. We talked about the support parents have provided, attending trainings, working with the teachers, working with the clinicians to provide, service to their child virtually. But these are the same people who next must turn to recovery, and that recovery is going to have to be delivered outside of the time when you would deliver, scheduled instructional services, or the delay to receive those services just extends. Mm-hmm. So, that's one of those realities that I think we're facing, that I'd really like to, engage with more teachers, more administrators to talk about it. We know we need to do this. How can we do this and help students, assist them in this recovery, and yet protect our staff? So I think those are two of the large questions looming out there. The compensatory services question, it depends. If you're in Maryland, the Maryland State Department of Education has issued guidance where recovery services and compensatory services are identified as the same service. And that's not consistent across states as far as my understanding is. I've read guidance from Ohio and Michigan, Virginia, just looking for some clarity. Again, trying to prepare myself and our programs for how are we going to recover. So, I think the assumption is that, again, because of this pandemic, because of the position that we're put in, that all students are going to need to be assessed to see if they've progressed as expected, and what we can do to help accelerate their progression when we have them back in front of us. So as an individual parent, the idea that recovery and compensatory services are the same thing, that's something that's a new concept to me, but I do understand it conceptually that, essentially we're all in the same boat. But again, talking about equity and service delivery, I think that some students were able to access virtual services at a much higher level than others, due to multiple reasons, and that there may be parents and students out there who do see the needs very differently. So, that's, of course, you should start with your local school system, but I think that that's a discussion that I think we're going to have more publicly in Maryland shortly, as we really, what I keep calling the recovery summer, as we enter.
I also think that what we have to keep in mind when we think about kids that are identified for special needs, as Cheryl said, they're often given a label, and that label is somewhat a misnomer in the sense that not every child with this label acts the same. In fact, they all act differently. They all have strengths and weaknesses, but they are given this label to be provided with services. So what's the critical piece in special ed is that it's individualized. They get identified, and then we provide, as educators, we provide an individualized educational plan for them. And so I think as we go through this recovery, we're going to have to go back to those individualized educational plans and determine, okay, where were they? Where did we want them to be? And now where do we need to go based on those assessments? Because I can't believe you can say for any one or any whole classroom how things are going. And I think nationwide, what people are saying, besides the shortage of teachers who will be able to direct that ship, we have a large number of general education students who struggled during this time and who left the classroom for reasons that we don't even know. They just stopped showing up. And so the graduation rate's going to be lower across the country. There's going to be a lot of missing kids. So I don't think it's just going to be the special ed kids that we're going to notice that are in need of some help. I think there's going to be a large number of general education students who are going to need some help during this time as well.
Thanks. Let me shift the focus to parents for a moment. So in the past year, has the role of parents of special needs students changed or become more prominent and during the past year and with the return to in-person schooling? Cheryl, let me throw that to you first.
I think Aaron, his comment that some parents feel isolated or abandoned, I think that is a common feeling of some parents that is, again, like I said, not knowing where to go for help or feeling unheard, deeply unheard as far as what they're experiencing at home, and no resources or a lack of sufficient resources. I do think that I'm speaking one school district, this will vary from school district to school district, but I do feel as though there has been more parent input and places to go for input. So it's been nice that we have a chat. We have a string, parents are kind of coming together more to talk about their children. I've noticed that we're doing more of that. The one good thing that has come out of this period is the IEP being virtual has allowed for more interaction between parents and special educators and all of the other providers that are on. I mean, it just seems like it's more flexible. There's more, you're not having to go to the school at a certain time, taking off of work, all of those things that sometimes can create barriers for parents being as engaged. It seems like some of that has been eased, and that is nice.
I do think that will continue, don't you?
I hope that will continue. I hope so.
I really hope that continues. And we've talked about it at Hopkins, providing a certificate for people to understand, school district people to understand how to chair an IEP meeting virtually, because I think a lot of families now have really enjoyed, if I could use that word, going to these IEP meetings because they feel more comfortable at home. They're not moving into a space that they don't know anyone or aren't sure who all these people are and feel like an outlier. They feel more comfortable because they're talking from their home, and they don't have to, like you said, Cheryl, they don't have to rush from a business meeting to get there. I know that my neighbor is a lawyer, And she had never been to her child's IEP until her child wasn't going to pass high school. So she said, would you come with me? So I went with her and explained how the process went. And I thought, your child got identified at age 7. Why are you now, so for many people, the IEP meeting has been impossible to go to or has been frightening to go to. And so having it virtual has, I think, been a tremendous thing. And I think we're training our teachers how to do it. And I think it should be something that we continue with after the pandemic.
I think that is
super. I agree. It's just one more tool in the parents' toolkit and one more way to get them connected. And I think for all of us, it's when you don't have to drive downtown or to another city for a meeting, you're more likely to attend. So I'm really hoping IEP attendance goes up.
I also think there's some parents who don't go to an IEP meeting, but have now been seeing their child learn from home. Yes. And they're learning things about their child's strengths and weaknesses about their child that they didn't even know existed because their child got good grades and now maybe is struggling in one particular area and they didn't understand that. And now they're seeing it. I know I come from a family, I have 11 brothers and sisters. I think my mother would have freaked out had she had all 12 of us at home. At one time,
I think she started her own school.
She kind of relaxed when she was only home with the young ones, it was like, and I say that relaxed jokingly. I mean, when she only had 3 or 4 at home, that was heaven to her. I can't imagine if she had had all of us home. And there are a lot of parents like that. They are struggling I was talking to one who works at Hopkins and she's a parent and she said, I have a nanny because I'm working, I'm going to school at night. My husband is working. We have 2 children under the age of 5. So I think we're now beginning to understand. I think we always understood it as educators, but I think going forward, we have to keep that memory alive of what it's like to be a parent of a special needs kid or a general education kid, any of those kids, and all the other calls that they have to answer to.
Yeah, I have also a friend that has a child with behavioral and emotional disabilities, and which created some acting out at school. This has been a really great, and when I say great, it's not great, but her child has not been suspended or sent to the office, although the negative consequences of some of those behaviors have not occurred. And so it's been this relief from some of those types of consequences and more attention to the actual behaviors and working at home with her child on changing those behaviors rather than some of the consequences of some of this child's disabilities in the learning setting. And it's been a relief and actually much more success. So I think there's certain pieces of, of virtual learning that there's certain aspects to this period that I think we should hold on to and think more deeply about how to integrate that into our normal way of schooling. Because there are some nuggets of wisdom in here and some nuggets of really good practices that I think we can take from this time as well.
I think there was an article, in the New York Times about a mom who had a child with ADD and he was flourishing because he didn't have to stay in his seat without moving for as long. If he was watching a video from his teacher that was recorded, he could go down and roll over on the rug if he wanted to, or go take a walk around the block and then come back to his work. So I think some kids have benefited from the flexibility in virtual learning, and we need to accent that and maybe bring those back to the classroom, recognize that these kids need to take a walk or a break a little bit more than we used to.
I think in the aspect of special education that a Kennedy Krieger Institute, focuses on, or schools like ours serve, I think it's going to be important to reintroduce the students very mindfully to the school setting. We have students with significant behavioral disability. We've had parents injured in the home during virtual services. We've had elopements out of the home. We have parents reporting major behavioral change over the course of a year, where they're really out of the school setting. And for us, they're receiving a lot of related services, in that setting as well. So I think making sure that, we're all ready to jump out of the gates to address this need that we know is there, but we have to recognize the person who's in front of us and where he or she has been for the last year. And for, some of our younger student that's in their pajamas, getting online to work with their teachers, and other students who really, haven't been able to successfully access virtual learning just because they really need an in-person, a highly trained staff member working with them individually. So I think we need to keep our expectations in check and understand what success is for this return to in-person services behaviorally as well as academically. So that's a discussion I want to have with parents and our local school system partners as well. Just that it's going to take a while to get the students comfortably back into the routine. And I think it is important. Parents also, need the schools open just because of the way our society is built and many parents' schedules are built. But when the students return to the in-person service, I think it's important to look at the expectations and realize that one of them has to be just being happy to be back in school and to feel good about being there, be successful there, knowing that we've got this hill that we're approaching. But I do have some concerns about, increased behavioral incidents with students with significant disabilities if the return to in-person services is rushed in some way, that because the instinct is you really want to go in and try to correct whatever you can, but I think we're going to have to do this very carefully, thoughtfully.
I also think we're missing a group of people that we haven't discussed yet, and those are the kids that we weren't identified as in need of services because they weren't in school, and yet we have a lot of children who get identified early on, either in preschool or in first or second grade. And because they weren't in that classroom setting, they may have been missed. And when we get back to in-person learning, they're going to be significantly further behind possibly. And we need to address those and not look at it as, well, look how many more deficits you have, Cheryl. Like you said, we can't look at it from the deficit perspective, but take them from where they are and then say, okay, here's what we need to do and what evidence-based practices we need to implement so that there is a difference at the end of next year. And we try and make more than a year's worth of growth with some of these kids. But I think that's going to take a large number of more staff to be able to do those types of assessments early on when we get back to in-person, because the psychologists who do that type of testing are probably going to be overworked.
Let me ask about a different group of missing students. Experts suggest that up to 3 million children have been completely disengaged from learning over the past year. And they suspect that there's many special needs students in this group. What kinds of programs or assistance do you think will be needed to re-engage these special needs students who've been missing in the past year? Laurie, what do you think?
I think there's, as Aaron said, I think we need to make it something that they want to become engaged with again, if they were there at one point. But remember back in 1975, when we passed the Public Law 94142, there was a lot of child find activities that the government invested some money into. And I think we need to start looking at that again. We need to find these kids, first of all, because they know how to hide when they're older. We need to find and offer them services that allow them to do something that they want to do. Like if it's older kids that they want to get a job or they want to get ahead. So I think the big thing is finding them first. And the second thing is offering them something of value to them, not to come back so that they can be either in, timeout or in some discipline or in some classroom that's pretty boring to them. And that might mean we expand the transition services that we offer for these kids and help them find some way to toggle between the classroom and where, if they're older kids, toggle between the classroom and their job. And Kennedy Krieger does that well, and so does some of the public schools in terms of helping these kids find employment and transition into maybe a community college setting, for instance. But we have to find them first, because as older kids, if they disengaged and left school, they know how to stay hidden. So we need to find them. And the only way we're going to find them is by attracting them back for things that will be of value to them.
Yeah, and the child find, era was primarily for young children,
Right.
pre-K, preschool age. And if we're doing a child find type of structure for high school students, we have to be sure it doesn't look like it's a truancy officer coming out to find them. That it is, as you said, Laurie, a more caring sort of engagement type of process. On a positive note, I think is really important. I know the Biden relief package, it's a lot of money, billions of dollars. We're not really sure how the districts will be using those funds to maintain teachers, but there is, if we are going to find students, we're going to need extra staff and well-trained staff. I could see counselors, I could see teachers doing this kind of work, re-engaging students to come back to school. But that's a new operation for a lot of districts.
It is. And I think there is money in that infrastructure plan. And I think there'll be there is more money in the infrastructure plan for preschools and childcare too. And I think that's where we could catch those younger ones. But for the older ones, it's going to take a whole new staff or a new direction of current staff, but add to that current staff. And I think some states are in need of special ed. There's such a national shortage of special educators now that we're going to have to do something to attract people into the special education field. And I know that was something we had thought about. I think the way we try to do it at Hopkins is we try to make partnerships with the school districts so that they can get some support financially. But I think it needs to be more than that. I think higher ed institutions need to think of ways to attract teachers. Granting agencies need to supply more grant opportunities for higher ed faculty to attract more teachers. But we need to really put a push out there for trying to get more teachers in the field.
I have to say that I was very excited by your comment, Laurie, and then yours, Cheryl, about a child find for older students. I didn't mention the bio, but the Neurodiversity at Work initiative at Kennedy Krieger is also one of in my portfolio, so to speak. I'm really lucky to be able to work with that group and have since really its start. So programs like Project Search, I mean, that's just to name one, but others that are for, transitioning youth, preparing them, for workforce development, I think could be essential in a way. I agree completely that these older students, again, there's no special education population. It's a lot of people just like the rest of us, so there's no single solution, but I think, bringing them back to something that's useful, that they're interested in, that, could result in workforce development for all of us could be just critical. And so I think that, we've got the students who haven't been identified coming in, and then we've got these students, we've got 2 school years now where the transition services have been, if not incomplete, they've been very different. A lot of virtually delivered transition services. I have not seen a lot of parents requesting to remain in school. I see most of them looking to transition out. And I think that's some of that is due to virtual services, if they really want something in person. But I don't know whether those transitioning youth are as prepared as they could be to make this step. And they're stepping into the cliff anyway, the end of services, into the adult world. But that certainly is a place that could use some attention, or will be trying to assist these, transitioning youth for many years to come.
I agree.
Yeah. And I think the community colleges, I just want to put a plug in for, we put a lot on community colleges, and they're already full to the max and need lots of services. But one of the areas that I think that I would love to see some of the funding go to community colleges to be more inclusive of the transition of special needs students to the workforce, as Erin said, I think is really important. And the community colleges could play a role in that. There could be a new division of a community college that could help with that transitioning, but that would take funding, because community colleges are really stretched right now with the general population. So this would be adding another sector, and it's great.
You can put a direct line to Jill Biden.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
I think we have our answer.
I just want to give you each, we're running out of time somehow. This hour flew past, and I want to give you all an opportunity for a parting thought with this final question. So we've talked a lot about different specific challenges. There's been a ton of issues put on the table, but just sort of more broadly speaking, what do you think we need to do? What do we need to prioritize? What do we need to do better in order to build our schools back better in the wake of all of this? Let's start with Aaron.
That is a tall question. That is a large order. I think that the place we need to start are the people working in the schools. And this is sort of my take from before, is that we're about to ask them to do something that's never been done before, after they're still, again, doing something that's never been done before. And these were an under-resourced profession before this began. So I think if we really want to stand our schools back up in a way that's robust, can help us recover, and to put us in the right position, it's a combination of things. But I think adequately resourcing the schools, both in training, staffing, a reward for the people who are willing to engage as a career in this field. I think that is the keystone. And then acknowledgement, both in the political conversation of the country and then also public policy, the acknowledgement about the disparity in access to both healthcare and education, and how that has put us where it has put us. And there's been major declines in employment and just other areas in society that have come to light, in this pandemic. And it's because the structures underneath them, while they were really hard fought, they're not completely solid in our society yet. And I think that we've got to acknowledge that as we head into this and direct the resources appropriately.
Great.
I would say we need to attract more teachers into the field of all colors and all levels of community, from rural to more urban to suburban. And the way that we do that is twofold. One, we need to provide more funding to train faculty to teach teachers, because we're running out of faculty. Believe it or not, there's a shortage of faculty going into, we're funding less faculty to go into become higher education faculty to teach teachers. And that means as you go down the pipeline, there's fewer teachers being trained by competent faculty who have been trained on how to teach teachers. But also we need to recognize that these are frontline workers for our children. They work with our children a large portion of every day, and we need to provide them with a salary that they can live on and respect them for the work that they do. And I think the pandemic has pointed that out to a lot of people. And I think we need to harness that memory in people's minds and put money behind it and try and get these people paid at an adequate rate so that they can do that job and not just be a spouse of a person to be able to afford to do that job.
Cheryl, the last word to you.
I would say we need policy change to ensure that we have sustainable change and to ensure that all students, regardless of their background, regardless of their racial background, economic background, that they're able to succeed. I think, in special education, the overrepresentation of students of color and boys in special education, it's a long-term, long-standing trend. And I think that gets back to some of the inherent policies that we have in our schools that work against some of our students. And I think this is the time, if any other time, to make some policy shifts, to include some of the things that we're talking about today, to engage students, to get them prepared for the workforce, to ensure that school is meaningful to them, it's accessible to parents. All of the things we talked about today are changes that possibly should have been made years ago. But the pandemic has accelerated this thought, which I'm happy about. But I think to build us back better is for policy change, to ensure that our behaviors also change as well.
And support the infrastructure. Make sure everyone has a Chromebook at home or has the technology, the internet.
We need internet in all of our communities. That's a universal Wi-Fi. I see that as an infrastructure change, but then we have to ensure that all students have access to it and are able to work on the internet, and teachers are able to teach virtually and remotely effectively. So there's some policies that need to change in there about expectations for teachers and expectations for students, but I'm looking forward to a new day, right?
That's great. I want to thank all our panelists for joining us this afternoon for this really terrific and insightful discussion. And we're going to be continuing to examine how American education is being transformed by this pandemic. Next week on April 12th, next Monday at 4 p.m., we will tackle mental health and social emotional learning in reopening of school. So we look at critical issues in the push to reopen schools. And we invite you to join us for this upcoming session. Our guests will include Holly Wilcox, who's a professor in the Department of Mental Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, Karen Weber, who's the Director of Education and Youth Development Program at the Open Society Institute, Peter Canham, who's the principal at Henderson Hopkins School, a terrific school that's near and dear to my heart, and Beth Marshall, the Assistant Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Adolescent Health and a member of our eSchool Plus team, will serve as the moderator. And finally, a big thank you to our entire eSchool Plus team who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to bring this project to fruition. As a reminder, the Johns Hopkins University eSchool Plus initiative is a collaboration between the Consortium for School-Based Health Solutions, the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, and the Johns Hopkins Schools of Education, Medicine, and Public Health. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you, our audience, for joining us this afternoon. My name's Alan Regenberg, and it's been my great privilege to serve as your moderator today. Thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you all soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks.
Thank you.